Hi, I'm Daniel Gregory. I'm a fine art photographer and photo educator based out of Whidbey Island up here in the state of Washington. I hope you and your family are safe and you're being able to take all the precautions you need to do during this kind of really difficult time for all of us. I know for me and my family, it's been some pretty unusual measures and we found ourselves kind of going a little stir crazy sometimes being isolated up here, but I think it's what we all have to do to make sure that we stay safe and sound. I'm so excited that you're able to join me here in the studio. I got a printing session today. This is actually my second printing session. Part one printing session for the virtual summit was kind of the nuts and bolts of getting Photoshop configured, ICC profiles, the print dialog box, some of the considerations about picking paper to make prints. This session is all about the workflow to actually make the print. So we're going to take all of that kind of theoretical knowledge from the first session and we're going to apply it into my actual printing workflow. And printing out of Photoshop, this is the actual workflow that I follow. This is the steps I actually take for making all of my prints. So hopefully there's things in here that you'll find interesting. This is where we'll also see some interesting things around how we decide resolution and output sharpening and some of those little decisions you're going to make that'll make a huge difference in the actual quality of your prints that you make when you start printing. We'll also take a look at the end of the session a little bit in Lightroom because I actually like to print out of Lightroom. It's one of my preferred printing tools. There's some great options in there, some great technology in there that makes printing a lot easier in some cases than printing out of Photoshop. So we'll take a look at that as well. When it comes to printing, there's an important thing about the hierarchy of how we approach our files and our workflow in Photoshop. We want to make sure it's non-destructive, and we also want to make sure that we're editing in such a way that we are kind of getting more and more constrained in the edits so that we make global edits first, regional edits next, local adjustments, and then we're going to make something called output-specific adjustments. Output-specific adjustments are done during the soft proofing process. And what they're for is when we talked in the first session about how monitors and printers and cameras, they all have different gamuts of color. They have different sets of color that they can deal with. That's all defined in their ICC profile. We can use soft proofing to simulate what's going to happen when we print. And from that simulation, we can make some editing decisions to help make sure that what's going to be on the monitor more closely reflects what's in the print. So in most cases, we're going to lose some saturation. We might lose some contrast. We might see some color shifts. So those are some considerations we have to think about when we're actually coming into the soft proofing workflow. But those adjustments we make are called output specific adjustments. They're only used and they're only turned on when we're printing to a certain output. And the great part about the workflow that I'm proposing that you consider is you can then have multiple output adjustments within the same file. And then if you're going to print to a matte paper one time and a glossy paper the next, you're always coming back to the same Photoshop file. And so instead of having to have multiple files and multiple photos, multiple different things to keep track of, you're only having to keep track of all of the edits within a single file. So that's kind of the workflow I developed. That's the workflow we'll be going through. So let's go ahead and jump into Photoshop and let's look at that workflow and how we would apply that into soft proofing. So in here, I've got a Photoshop file from Arches National Park that I want to print. And I've got here some global adjustments. I've done a bunch of work in Camera Raw. And then I came in here and I did an orange saturation boost. I did a mid-tone contrast. And anything that's a global adjustment, I put in the global adjustments folder. If I had regional and local adjustments, we'd see those as well. But now it's going to come time to make some soft proof adjustments. So I actually want to print this photograph and I want to print it on one of my printers. So I need to see what's going to happen with that. And that's the purpose of soft proofing. Before we had soft proofing, it was not uncommon to have to make dozens of prints to actually get what you wanted. Soft proofing is not going to be a one and done every time. Some cases it might be, but if you're going to print, soft proofing is going to have you go from having to use 15 sheets of paper to maybe 5 sheets of paper. So it's worth it to spend the time to kind of figure out how to read and understand what you're seeing in the soft proofing and then not have to spend so much time actually guessing what's going to come out of the printer. So it's a little bit of a transition to get used to see because it's once you know what to look for, it's pretty easy. But during this initial time, it can be a little confusing because of what you're seeing on the screen is just a facsimile representation of what might be possible as it comes out of the printer based on that ICC profile. So in Photoshop to soft proof, we go up to the View menu, there's Proof Setup, and then you're going to select Custom. When you select Custom, it opens up the the customized proof condition. So this is actually to set the soft proofing on. And a device to simulate is where you're going to select the ICC profile of the paper you're going to print to. So in this case, I could choose, say, Exhibition Fiber, or I could choose Hot Press Natural. So in this case, I'm going to choose Hot Press Natural. When this first turns on, Simulate Paper Color and Black Ink is going to be turned off. You have to turn that on. This is what you can see. It actually dulls down the photograph in the image. This is now simulating the brightness of the paper, the contrast of the paper. So this is why we need that turned on, so we can see what's actually happening or potentially going to happen when we actually make the print. And you can see here, I've just actually lost a little bit of vibrancy in the blues, a little bit in the yellows, and some of my shadow detail is blocked up. Now, the other thing we can look at here is we can also look at the rendering intent. So with Simulate Paper Color on, I'm going to zoom in here a little bit on this image because I'm going to watch this area down in here, right in here. If I change the rendering intent to perceptual and I turn the preview on and off, okay, and I change the relative on and off, I actually think I get a little bit more detail preserved back in there with the perceptual. I think my black holds a little bit better with perceptual. So in that case, I would lean towards perceptual with this image, but with a different image or a different paper, I might choose relative. So let's go on ahead and choose, say, that exhibition fiber paper again, and there's perceptual and there's relative. And in this case, you know, if I turn that on and off, I actually think relative might actually give me, they're roughly the close, but I would probably go with relative in this case. So you always want to check both rendering intents based on the paper you're printing to. Now remember, perceptual is going to move all the colors perceptually related to one another. Relative is going to move the colors that are out of gamut to the nearest reproducible color. The thing you want to watch for is weird artifacts and weird color changes. So if all of a sudden you had shadows appear really strangely colored, or if you had lines start to appear in a gradation, anything where you see an odd artifact appear, you definitely want to check the other rendering intent. Once I have this up, I now have the image set to be soft proofed and I can make adjustments. So if I turn this off and on, just Command Y or Control Y toggles on and off the soft proof. So you can see I do lose a little bit of contrast. My blue's not quite as saturated. So there's some adjustments here I could make in the soft proof to better make sure that what comes out of the printer matches what's on the screen, and those are the output of specific adjustments. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a folder, and in this case, I'm going to be printing this to an Epson 7900, and this is hot press bright natural paper. So any of the edits that are going to be in this folder are specific to that paper. Now let's say like I was also going to do a different paper. Let's say I was going to do an Epson P800, and I was going to do Hahnemuhle Fine Art Beretta. If I was going to print to the Beretta, I would turn those soft output adjustments on. And if I was going to print to the 7900 on the Hot Press Bright, I would choose those on. Either one of those options would only be turned on based on the media I go on. This is why I like this workflow. I have one master file that contains all of the edits. These edits at the very top of the stack are only there to offset the change caused by the colors that and tones that would shift. So what do we look for in soft proofing? We look for unwanted color changes. We look for loss of detail in shadow or highlight, and we look for contrast issues. So we're not looking to make it, it's never going to be a 100% exact match, but what we're looking for is significant changes to the image where things may be different or lost during the translation from one profile to the next. I always try to get it as close as I can and then make a print, because you ultimately need to judge based on the quality of the print because it's the definitive thing. So one of the other things that comes up all the time working with soft proofing is people worry about colors that are out of gamut. Now remember, we talked about perceptual and relative rendering intent dealing with those out of gamut colors. So I'm going to go on ahead and bring this image up real fast to cover this out of gamut issue. So this image, if you want to see gamut warnings, actually under preferences, there's transparency and gamut. You can actually set the color of the gamut warning right here. So that way, if you're dealing with a green image and your color warning was green, you can set it to whatever you want. I've set this to gray. You just click in there, you'll get the color picker. Under the view menu, you've got gamut warning. So I'm going to go ahead and hit that, bring up the gamut warning, and you can see now everything that's in gray is now considered out of gamut. Now in this case, this image is designed to simulate the sRGB color space. So there's the image, there's everything that's out of gamut. Now I could try to make adjustments to bring that into gamut, but I don't think you need to do that to start. Where you need to do is actually see how the rendering intent deals with the colors that are out of gamut. And if it becomes a problem, then you can make the adjustment. So how do we check that? So remember, here's everything that's out of gamut, meaning there's a problem in that color. So to test this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up to File, Export. I'm going to do this as an export as a JPEG. So when this comes up, we're going to leave a high resolution JPEG. We're going to go ahead and embed the color profile and convert it to sRGB. I'll go ahead and choose export. I'm going to save, we'll replace that. So now that that's been created, we've done the export. Let's go ahead and open that file up that we just created, which is right here is that JPEG. We open that, use the embedded profile so it stays in sRGB. Here's before and here's after. Now you can see there's a subtle change there in the quality of the reds, but that did a pretty good job of dealing with that rendering intent, given the fact that this is everything that's out of gamut in that image. I would probably take that, and if I wasn't looking at them side by side, I'm not even sure after a time I would be able to tell the difference between those unless I had them visually as a reference. So don't worry about your out of gamut warnings initially. Worry about saturation loss, color change, and loss of detail. So when we come back into that original image now, we have those soft proof adjustments for the hot press natural. Let's go ahead and take a look at those. And what I'm going to do now is, like I said, it's challenging to actually see what you have in the one image versus the other image. Okay, so we're going to come back to this original image. Now, if I toggle on that Command Control Y, you can see the difference, but this is going to be hard to edit this way. So what you're going to want to do is make a second copy. So you're going to go to Image, and you're going to choose Duplicate. It doesn't matter what you call it. So I'm just go ahead and just leave the copy name. Now, this is the image that I'm soft proofing. This is the version of the original. Okay, so that's what it looks like. That's what the soft proof. So here's what I want it to look like. Here's what the soft proof. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to come up here and I'm going to arrange these so that they're a 2-up vertical. So now I can see what my original image looks like and the soft proof version. So in the soft proof version now, what I'm going to do is come in and let's just go ahead and create a new adjustment layer. Let's do a hue saturation. Okay, in this case, we're just going to boost that saturation up just a little bit. Okay, and then in the blues, I feel like I need a little bit more. So that's starting to look a little closer to me. And then, so I've got a color here. So let's go ahead and change that. That's a saturation adjustment. And then I also feel like I've got a loss of detail, down there in my shadow. So if we zoom in here, you can see it feels like there's just a little loss of shadow detail. Not much, but a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead back into this one, and I'm going to go ahead and create another adjustment layer. I'm just going to do a curves adjustment layer. Because it's dealing with luminosity, I want that below my saturation adjustment. So I'm going to go ahead and change that to a luminosity blend mode. In the layer stack, I want luminosity and then hue saturation adjustment. So in this case, I'm going to come in and I'm just going to open up that shadow just a smidge on that image. Now you can see that I've got that shadow detail kind of looks close. Now, there's this kind of muted quality to this image. That's because it's simulating going to a matte paper. So the matte paper contrast range is about 35:1. So I just go ahead and accept that. I'm not going to be able to get all of that same haze off of there. Don't worry about getting rid of the haze. You're just trying to get that shadow detail, unwanted color shifts to be what they are. Once you have the soft proof done, that work done in there, whatever it is, maybe you need to do a mask, maybe you need to make some other adjustment, doesn't matter. You can turn off the copy. This is now our master image. We've done the soft proofing. We've made the adjustments for luminosity and hue saturation. So here's what those changes are. So the thing that's weird about this is you're going to send the soft proofing edits to the printer. So even though it's going to look wrong on screen, you're going to attempt to do that so that you get what looks right on print. So you're sending the wrong stuff from the screen to the printer, but it's to offset that simulation. So hot press bright off, here's those adjustments, and you can see it really kind of opened up the image a little bit, and maybe I like that. Sometimes when you soft proof, you learn that, oh wow, I should re-edit my master file. That's fine too. Sometimes printing teaches you a better way to edit. Okay, so all that workflow to do actually the duplicate and all that, I've created an action I'm going to give you, and I'll go ahead and run the action now so you can see it, but it basically does the duplicate of the image, does the tiling and all that for you. So if we go over here to my actions, go ahead and click on soft proof. Here's a soft proofing action. Go ahead and run that. And while that runs, you can see it's going to flatten an image, bring it over, and then you've got the duplicate copy. The original one you're actually going to be proofing, and then you get to choose what you're actually going to simulate. So in this case, if I chose, say, Legacy Beretta, you can see it's the Legacy Beretta on this side. Now I can actually make my edits here, and I have the proof here. So all the work to do the duplicate, choose the view and all that, I've got an action for you, and that's included in the sample downloads. You'll get that. So with all that being done, we're ready to now take the next step to actually the actual printing workflow. So I've got my master image here, and we're ready to make this the image that we're going to print. When we go to print, remember, we had some considerations we needed to think about. We need to think about the actual size we're going to print. We need to think about the resolution we're going to print at. And we needed to think about output sharpening. So how do I tackle that? Because this original master file, I don't want to mess with those pixels. I've done as much non-destructive work as possible here. So I don't want to resample, resize any of these pixels if I can help it. So how do I deal with that in my workflow? I'm going to actually print out of a second image. I do all of my work in a secondary image so that the original remains as intact as possible. So what I'm going to do in this image is I've got my image set up here to go to print. I go to image and I choose duplicate. And I can call it whatever I want. This is to print. You may or may not save this file. I don't ever save these files. I just recreate the workflow anytime I need to do it again because I have the original master pixels to work with. But in your case, if you had an 8x10, a 16x20, and you had the disk space, you could go ahead and recreate that. But in this duplicate now, I'm ready to come up and do my sizing information. So I'm going to come to image size. So in here, you can see I've got a resolution set of 240 pixels per inch. You will read all the literature will tell you as long as you're above 180, 240, you're fine to print. You get the resolution. Well, what happens in the print pipeline is the printer will do a resampling up to that pixels per inch that it's expecting as its native input. The question becomes then, do you want Photoshop's math to do that or the print pipeline's math to do that? And people have said, well, does it actually matter? Does it make a difference? I've got two images here I'm going to open up, and we're going to take a quick look at those where we can actually see the effect of that. Same image printed, same paper, same everything, scanned back in. The image on the right here was sent at 360 pixels per inch out of Photoshop to the printer. The image on the right was sent at 240 pixels per inch to the printer. They both got sharpened. They both got everything. The one on the left was sharpened for 240 pixels per inch. The one on the right was sharpened for 360. So all things were equal. And if you look, you can just see you end up with a little bit sharper image. Look at the eyelashes. Look at the detail in the eye. You just end up with a slightly sharper image. And the reason for that is the print driver has upsampled from the 240 to the 360. In its upsampling process, the resampling it did caused a degradation in quality. The sharpening we do is size and resolution dependent. So if you sharpen for 240 and upsample to 360, there's going to be an impact to the level of sharpening. So if you get this quality bar adjustment here, where you get a difference between 240 and 360, why not let Photoshop handle that work and let you see what you're going to get out of the printer before you send it to the file? So when it comes to resampling and resizing, that's why I like to get my image duplicated and then deal with all the resizing questions. So if I come back to this image and I do an image size, my resolution's 240. Well, I know I'm going to an Epson printer, so that needs to be 360. Not 460, 360. Now, without resampling, I'm printing 23 by 14. But if I needed to make that difference, I would resample. And let's say I want to do 20 by 30 for my print size. Under the resampling, I've got several options. I've got preserve details, bicubic smoother, bicubic sharpener, bicubic nearest neighbor, and bilinear. In general, bicubic smoother is going to work best for enlargement. Bicubic sharper is going to work for reduction. We can upsample better than we can downsample. You're better to go up in pixels than reduce pixels. So if you want to preserve your image quality, it's better to go up than down. When we come down, what happens is because we're tossing pixels out, we actually will end up with a softer image. So the bicubic sharpener will go in and enhance some of the sharpening as it's tossing out those pixels. Automatic will look at the contents of the image and decide if you're going up and down and select what you need automatically. I usually default to automatic, and if it doesn't look great, I'll go in and select one of the ones for the preservation. Now, what's nice about preserved details, is you get an option for noise reduction. So one of the things that resampling up does is it will enhance noise because it finds the edges of the noise and creates more crunchy texture there. So sometimes if you've got a really noisy image, the preserve detail and apply some noise reduction can help with that. But in general, I would go ahead and choose automatic. I click OK. Now it's going to resample the file up 360 dots per inch at 20 by 30 inches. So now I get the print I want to come off my big printer in the back. Now, if I'm going to say go down in size, so that original image was 15 by 22 at 240. So if I'm going to come in and say make that image smaller, maybe I want to go to 8 by 10. I'm now faced with an interesting question. If I look at the image size now and I don't resample, and I look at say a 12 by 8, I'm at 688 pixels per inch. Now remember, I said if we go down to the 360, I'm going to lose quality and sharpness because it's going to be tossing out those pixels. So in this case, I'm going to upsample to 720. That's the next step in the equation. So that question of, do I go to 360 or 720? If I'm above 360, I go up to 720. If I'm below 360, I go up to 360. So I'm going to go ahead and here and say, make this, I'm going to resample this up to the 720. And people say, well, what about the hit there that I'm going to take and letting Photoshop do the resampling? As we saw in the demo with the eye with eyelashes, it's better to let Photoshop handle that upsampling because I can actually see the upsampling during that process. So in the resize, this is where I'm making that decision. Now, if this was a Canon, and we come back in, and I have my original image, and I came in here and I had the question of image size, and I was going to go to that, say that 12 by 8 and not resample, go to 12 by 8 at 680, I would drop that back down to 600 if I was on a Canon printer, or I would go up to 1200 if I was on the new Canon Pro 1000. So making that resolution decision, again, this is a finesse thing in the print, but it will make all the difference in the world in getting that quality up. So I'm going to go ahead and we'll assume I'm sending this to my Epson printer, so I'm going to go ahead and do a 720. So now I've got my image resized. I'm working in a duplicate here. At this point, I don't even need these layers. I could flatten the image if I wanted, just to save space within the piece. So I can go ahead and flatten, because these adjustments here, if I needed to make an adjustment at this point, I would go on ahead and go back to the original master file that I made the duplicate out of and make the adjustment there. This is literally just for printing options. Okay, so I've made the duplicate. I've got the resizing done. And the order of this is important. We want to make sure that we get the size of the print decided and the resolution accounted for so that we can now do the output sharpening. Output sharpening should be the last step of the equation because that sharpening is size and resolution and viewing distance dependent. So how do we go about actually output sharpening? Okay, remember that output sharpening is all about offsetting dot gain. So as the ink hits the paper, that ink spreads out as it absorbs into the substrate, causing softness to appear. So we need to offset that. In the first class on printing, we looked at an example of output sharpening and not output sharpening. And you can see that up on the screen now. And that output sharpening definitely helps make sure that you get that level of sharpness that you're looking for what you see on the screen. So remember, this is not to add sharpness. You're not trying to make the image sharper. You're actually making sure that you don't end up with a softer image than what you were expecting. It is also one of those things that it's difficult to see on screen exactly the level of sharpening you need to do. Usually I view sharpening at 100% when I'm making a sharpening decision, but when I'm dealing with output sharpening, 50% view is probably a good one. You don't want to be at 33 or 66.7 because Photoshop's interpolated some of that information, but at the 50% mark, you get a better rendering of what's be possible. At 100%, it'll feel like your image is going to come out too sharp. So it's a little bit more egregious than people want. So that's a piece we have to figure out. Now, the other thing that's interesting about output sharpening is because it is image size dependent, resolution dependent, and substrate dependent, you have different levels of sharpening if you're doing 8 by 10 versus 11 by 14 versus 20 by 30. It's different if you're on glossy paper. It's different if you're on matte paper. So it's one of the areas where I actually do recommend a third-party tool for this. Whether you're using NYX output sharpener or you use Pixel Genius created PK sharpener, which has a wonderful output sharpener in it. It's actually the foundational information for how we actually print out a Lightroom's output sharpener is very similar to that. It's the actual same technology, the same team that designed PK Sharpener also designed and helped Adobe create the output sharpening and the sharpening engine in Lightroom. So you can download that for free now and use that as a free plugin as well. Topaz has some output sharpening. They're all great. But some of you don't want to buy a plugin. So what's the general rule for output sharpening? Well, Bruce Fraser wrote the book, The Real World Sharpening. And at the time it was figured out for most prints, it was in the 1/100th of an inch was the factoring figure we could figure out. And so if you're printing at 300, 360, a radius of about 3.6 on your output sharpening would get you what you needed. Even if you're at 720, 7 is going to be a little high. So it's usually going to be in that 3 to 5 range for your output sharpening. Whether you use Smart Sharpen or you use a high pass filter, you just need to get some level of sharpening in there. So let's jump back into the Photoshop file here. I'm going to duplicate that layer and change that blend mode to luminosity because I want to do sharpening on it. And so I'm going to come down here. Let's just do, say, a sharpen, and let's do a Smart Sharpen. I prefer to do Smart Sharpen because when you have remove, let's get over here and get on an actual piece of rock we can see here. When you actually do the lens blur, it has a edge awareness to it. So for the radius, I'm going to go ahead and bring that radius up to about 3. Set my amount to 150 or so. You can see I've got that halo in there is pretty strong. Set my amount to say 100. You can see I've got a pretty good halo in there as it renders here on the preview. I'll zoom in here on the actual image. So you can see there's actually a pretty good halo on that. That might be a little strong, so I might drop that down to about 2.5. I would need to print. Now this is assuming I'm printing on a pretty large image. So somewhere around there, I could go on ahead and actually apply my output sharpening. Now the other thing about output sharpening, so we're gonna go ahead and let this run. The other thing I usually like to do is I like to offset and use the blend if sliders, and I can basically use it to offset the lightness and darkness of the halos and whether it's going to be in a shadow element. So after this processes, we'll go on ahead and jump in and do a little blend if work, pull some of this sharpness out of the highlights and out of the shadows, so we're kind of preserving some of that work within the midtones. So now that that's run, what I can do is come into the blend if sliders here, and I can allow some of that underlying layer work to come through and fade off some of that effect right in here on the sharpening. So you can see I get a little bit of help on the intensity of that halo by blending that out. So a lot of times I use the blend if sliders for that, and that gets me my level of output sharpening. I could do the same thing if I was doing a high pass filter. The other piece you can do is I can duplicate that background layer, and then I could actually separate and use one layer for basically dealing with the highlights and fading those off, and the other layer for dealing with the shadows. That's what you'll find in a lot of the advanced tools. I'm going to go ahead and delete those 2 layers. If I run the PK Sharpener, output sharpener, you can see here it's got output sharpener for an inkjet printer. I'm going to a matte paper, and currently it's a 720 pixels. For the image, click OK, and then it's going to actually process and do my output sharpening. And then I have with 2 layers here, and I get light contours and dark contours. But again, you can see the sharpening. If I zoom in here, you see that's a pretty good chunk of sharpening happening on that edge, which might be a little more than you expect, but again, it's an offset there. The last little piece we'll take a quick look at is under filters. If those of you who have the Nik plugin suite, you've all got an output sharpener plugin that's in there. So we'll go ahead and let that run for a second. And what's nice about this is you can really see the level of sharpening from different settings as you come in. So we go ahead and we choose, we're going to print to an inkjet printer. Ask us what kind of paper we're going to go to. Let's say we're going to a matte paper. The printer resolution, so this isn't the pixels per inch you're sending, this is the resolution of the printer. So let's say I'm going to do 2880 by 1440. And there you can see on viewing distance for auto, but for the image size I've got here, you can see that's actually a pretty strong effect on that sharpening as well. So again, the output sharpening is usually more than you think it needs to be. What's interesting about this, if I change the viewing distance, you can see how much stronger that sharpening gets. So here at 3 meters, you can see I need a lot more sharpening to get the same effect as if I was closer. So that's why all of this work to figure out sharpening, it's why I do like third-party tools, because if not, you've got to do a lot of print testing to figure out what is that exact amount of sharpening you need to do. But no matter what tool you use, it's the last tool. I'll set this back to auto. It's the last thing that applies into your workflow stack is that level of sharpening. So in this case, sharpening is being applied into this layer. I've got my output sharpening done. That's probably a little strong for my personal taste, so I'll probably back that off about 40%, 50%. So this is what I would then send to the printer and then judge the level of sharpness based on what comes out of the printer. Again, the print is the final end-all be-all of the process. So for output sharpening, about 1/100th of a presentation of your pixels. So if you're doing 300 pixels per inch, 600 pixels per inch, you're gonna be in that 3 to 4 range. And then you can always dial it back to taste. A little aggressive doesn't hurt, and use that opacity slider to bring it back. Once I have this piece done, this image has been set. The image size is set. I'm going 720 pixels per inch. Basically 11 by 7.5. That's what's going to the printer. It has the right output sharpening on it. This is the image I'm gonna print. Remember, it came in with the soft proof adjustments, got duplicated, we flattened it, we resized it and resampled it through image size to the right dimensions and depth. Then we applied the output sharpening, and now we're actually ready to go to print. So we go to print this now. We can go up to File and choose Print. Okay, with the print dialog box open, I'm gonna go ahead and select the printer I want to print to. In this case, that was an Epson 7900 because that's what I soft proofed for. Photoshop is gonna manage the colors, and I'm printing to the hot press natural paper. And remember, I chose the perceptual rendering intent. So everything you did in soft proofing in terms of rendering intent, paper profile, comes back to play in the print dialog box. So you're gonna wanna make notes for that so you know what you actually did. So you can come back in and do paper profile, make sure you've got that set, make sure you've got the right printer selected, make sure you get the right rendering intent selected. You wanna have black point compensation checked. You can send the 16-bit data. And in this case now I just need to set my paper size. So in this case, I'm gonna just go ahead and print this on, let's print this on 17 by 22 paper. Go ahead and click Save. Now I'm gonna go ahead and get my image up, rotate. So now I've got my image being printed. You can see here there's an offset of a border right here, and that's because the Epson printer has a 0.56 inch border based on what's currently set up on the printer. So for that being set in there, I can come down here and make sure that I'm centered within the image, and it'll offset that. So you just wanna make sure you got your image set. Again, I don't do any scaling or resizing here because we did all of that work back in the actual to be printed file. At this point, I could go ahead and click print. When I get that print back, what I'm gonna do is take a look at it, see how it looks based on what I was expecting to see on the screen. Because I made those soft proofs as a simulation of what would happen. I can go on ahead and then make the decision of what other adjustments might need to happen based on the paper. When you're soft proofing to matte paper, it usually takes people a few more revs to get through that. The glossy paper seems to, and the luster paper seem to reflect the monitor a little bit better from what we expect. But matte paper has a beautiful richness to it. And if you've never printed on matte paper, it's worth the time to learn to print on matte paper and appreciate the rich, beautiful tones and colors that come from printing on a matte paper. It's a different experience than glossy paper, but it's definitely worth looking at. Okay, so I've got this image printed. Now let's say like in my workflow, I wanted to come back in later and I wanted to print this image again. So different size, different image. I'm gonna come back in, I grab this. I'm gonna go in image duplicate, print. I'm gonna flatten the image because I don't need any of those adjustments. Might as well save the space and the processing power. Again, once that's flattened, I'm gonna go up to image size. And I want to do a print that is 20 by 30 at 275. So I'm going to need to resample that. In this case, I'm going to go up to 360. Click OK. After it's done processing and doing the upsampling size, then I will apply the output sharpening, go back to the print dialog box, make the print, and I'm ready to go. So every time I go to print, I jumped through this same hoop on the duplicate. What I have found is this keeps me from having to worry about making edits in the print file that didn't make it back into the master file. So sometimes I would come back to print 6 months, a year later, the same image, and I was finding that the print no longer matched. We're going to talk about that piece in a second, but it wasn't matching. So I knew I had to make everything happen back in the master file. Once that happened, then I knew I was okay. Okay, when it comes to printing in Photoshop, one of the things you're seeing is there's a bunch of decisions we're making about printing. We're making decisions about size, we're making decisions about output sharpening, we're making decisions about paper choices, all sorts of things. That needs to be tracked. You want to make sure you have that information on file somewhere. So one of the ththings you can do is create a Bonnetier print or a bat print and make all the annotations on the back. That bat print is basically, it's a master proof that says when you come back to print a year later, you compare the two prints together, and if the prints match, then you know everything is okay. The printing notes on there tell you what printer it was printed on, substrate it was printed on, the date that it was printed on, all of those various elements that would be necessary for you to be able to recreate the print. Now, one of the things you can do in Photoshop is we can use the annotation tool in Photoshop to help us create some notes. So this is a great place to add notes into Photoshop. The annotation tool is located under the eyedropper tool. So if you click on there, you'll see the note tool. You bring that up, you can then basically, you can put it anywhere, but I just put a note up there. And then over here, you've got the notes field. So you can type in here that this was, printed on 3/20/04/19. If it's in paper, size is 720. Sharpening was a high pass filter at radius of 3.4. So you can have those notes in there. Now the notes won't print. And so anytime you want to come back and review the notes, you can click on the note and get the note up and actually get the information there. Doesn't ever print, but it's a great place to store that information if you aren't going to actually record it physically on the back of, say, a sample print or something like that. But you definitely want to make sure you leave those printing notes for yourself. Okay, I'm going to jump over quickly into Lightroom because a couple of things in Lightroom that are really nice. Let's go ahead and just grab this image here. We'll come into the print module. And a couple of things here that I want to show you that are important, answer those same questions we had in Photoshop about resolution and size. So under the guides, you've got the option to show dimensions. When you do that, up here you'll see in the upper left-hand corner, I'll turn that off. See the upper left corner here, you've got the actual inches for the print size. In this case, we're on a 24 by 17 inch sheet of paper. We're making a print that size. Down here under the print job, you've got print resolution. So if I uncheck print resolution, you can now see that this print at 14 inches by 22 inches would be at 193 pixels per inch. So in this case, that would tell me that I do need to check the print resolution and upsample to 360 or 300. If I change the size of this print, I'm going to uncheck that print resolution. If I come up here and I change the size of the cells, you can see all of a sudden now that I'm at 415 pixels per inch. If that was the case, I'd come down to print resolution and select the 720 if I was going to an Epson printer, or I'd go to 600 if I was on a Canon printer. You'll get the warning dialog box here that says you're sending too much data to the printer, but don't worry about that. For print sharpening, this is where I really like printing out of Lightroom. For print sharpening, all I need to know is standard, low, and high. Standard is for a print that has a lot of high frequency and low frequency information, a lot of smooth gradations and texture. A portrait, for example, or a normal photograph. High would be if you have a lot of really high texture, like you're doing a landscape with a lot of fine trees, or you have a brick wall or something like that. And low would be if you have really subtle gradations, real smooth tones with not a lot of edges. For the most part, you could choose standard, and then you just need to know matte or glossy. In Photoshop, we had to know all of the information about resolution and print size and paper and all that to make the decision for how much to sharpen. In Lightroom, they already have all that information. So they take that same technology and apply it and process it as the last thing it does before it goes to the printer. This is the same brains behind the PK sharpener. It's why printing out of Lightroom is so great, because you're going to get the benefit of one of the best output sharpening engines automatically. In addition to that, you get the benefit of the batch printing and all of that. But for output printing, I wanted to make sure you saw how to check your resolution so you knew where to check that in the print dialog box. Now remember, when you come into the printer and you're actually going to print, if you're printing to 720 and you're actually going to print to an Epson printer, you're going to show the details, and under that print settings, that finest detail checkbox should only be checked if your print resolution is at 720. If your print resolution is 360, you want to uncheck finest detail. It's a misleading checkbox in my opinion, because of course I want the finest details. But we don't want to inadvertently upsample, because remember, all that sharpening was done at that pixel resolution and that resolution depth. So we don't want to inadvertently change that. If you're on a Canon printer, you can come down into quality and media, and your print quality is here. You would just need to look to see what the actual level is between your fast and fine. Fine is going to be your highest one, and on this case of this printer, this would be 600 pixels per inch is what the expectation would be there. So I would set it for fine if I was doing 600 pixels. But just check inside your manual for your Canon printers if you're doing that. Since I print Epson printers, I don't know the exact information on all the Canon printers to tell you what to do there. So for printing out of Lightroom, remember, you've got to check that show information under guides and check that dimension box, and then uncheck print resolution so you can see what that resolution is to know what you need to send there. One final thing to do in Lightroom, if you're going to go back and forth, under your preferences, you've got external editing. In here, if you normally print to an Epson printer, you can set that resolution to 360 when it goes into Photoshop, and you'll get the correct resolution going into Photoshop when you're working with the actual image. So that way your resolution natively is correct. If you're doing Canon, you can do 300, and that way you don't have to worry about a reinterpolation of those pixels in Photoshop when you're natively working with them in your master file. So that's one little tip for doing that. So from a workflow standpoint, master file, all the edits go into the master file, including the output adjustments for soft proofing. Remember, in soft proofing, we're looking for saturation changes, contrast changes, loss of detail, and color shifts. We don't worry about the out of gamut unless we print and the gamut is so messed up. We let the rendering intent deal with that. Once we have the master file done, duplicate the master file, flatten the master file, then do your resizing and resampling if necessary, then apply your output sharpening and go on ahead and go to print. That way you're assured of getting the best print possible, getting the maximum quality possible. Again, sharpening, use a third-party tool will make it easier because they've already done all the research to figure out what is the appropriate pixel depth. Be a little more aggressive than you want. Back that off in the opacity in Photoshop, and I think you'll get some amazing prints. Last couple of things about printing that are important to consider. When you're making prints, they come off the printer, they need to sit for 24 hours, kind of unboxed and not framed or under glass. They need to off-gas. So the glycol and the elements that suspend that pigment when it gets put onto the page, they need to come off. If not, you'll end up with a haze that exists inside a glassed frame. So make sure they off-gas for 24 hours. If you're on a matte paper, sign it with a pencil. If you're on a glossy paper, use an archival pen. So a Micron Pixma pen or an archival pen, not a permanent pen. You want to make sure you don't destroy the archivability of your print by signing it inadvertently. So go on ahead and make sure you do that. Store your prints flat so they don't develop a curve. Store your boxed paper so when paper comes in, you don't want to stick it in the bookshelf vertically. You want to make sure it lays flat. If not, it'll develop a curve and it'll get caught in the printer. So there's a number of things around the paper and paper qualities you can check on as well. For bonus materials, I've got a handout for you about fine art printing. It covers signing pages, editioning, printing, soft proofing, all of those pieces. You'll get the paper quality handout. I've got a number of Photoshop actions I'll give you for actually helping you work through some printing information, some printing techniques and things like that. Mid-tone contrast, the soft proofing, black booster for dealing with matte paper. So you'll get 5, 6, 8, 10 actions for that. So you get that in the VIP bonus material as well. Don't forget, if you missed my first class and you're just kind of thinking about, well, what are some of these basic techniques? Check that out. I really do appreciate you tuning into the virtual Photoshop Summit. I hope you're getting a lot of information. There's a lot of great classes. It's a great opportunity. Don't forget, if you sign up for that VIP bonus pass, you can get access to the classes anytime outside the actual running of the virtual summit. And again, I know it's a difficult time for everybody. I appreciate you tuning in, but please take care of your family. Make sure you stay safe and you do everything you can to make sure we all stay safe. I know it's a hard time for everybody, but I know together we can pull through and get this all done. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really do appreciate it. Again, my name is Daniel Gregory, and I appreciate you learning about how to print. Good luck with everything. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. My contact information is up on the Summit site, and I'll be happy to do anything I can to help you out. Thanks, and have a great day.